If someone tells you they gave you something, but years later tries to claim it back, what they really gave you wasn't generosity, it was leverage. That's where my story begins. For a long time, our home felt like a place built on gratitude. Her contribution, our effort, a shared vision of stability. We thought the down payment she transferred to us was a blessing, a gesture from a mother who wanted her son to start his life on steadier ground. We thanked her. We honored her. We welcomed her into every decision that followed. But the truth is, you never really see the cracks in a gift until the giver wants something in return. It didn't happen all at once. It began with comments about paint colors, then about the nursery, then about holidays and weekends and who we owed our time to. At first, the requests sounded harmless, reasonable even, but eventually the tone shifted, subtly, then sharply. Suddenly she wasn't asking, she was assuming. And one evening, she looked across our dinner table with absolute certainty and said, "I'm moving in. I paid for part of this house. It's my right." That sentence changed everything. What followed wasn't a fight. It was a slow unraveling of assumptions, loyalties, and truths buried under the polite surface of family. It was the discovery of documents that didn't match her story. It was the realization that boundaries aren't anti-family, they're the only thing that protects it. This is the story of how we learn to separate generosity from control, love from obligation, and truth from the narratives people build when they're afraid of losing their place. If you're ready for the full journey, stay with me, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. My mother-in-law set the folder down on the kitchen table, as if it were a verdict. The cover made a soft shuffle, barely a sound, yet it settled into the room with an authority she didn't need to raise her voice for. "The down payment money was mine," she said, smoothing the edge of the table with her fingertips, like she was reacquainting herself with a piece of property she believed she owned. The porch light outside spilled through the window, a thin amber line crossing the folder's corner. She had timed the moment well. No anger, no flourish. Just a quiet stake in the ground. I kept my voice flat. The house is in our name, my husband's and mine. I set the keys on the table so deliberately, the metal barely clicked. Her eyes followed the motion, then returned to my face, measuring something I didn't give away. I didn't lift my chin or narrow my gaze. I just held my posture, the way you hold a line in sand you refuse to let the tide erase. The air between us was steady, but the space felt rearranged, as if someone had moved a piece of furniture without asking. She tapped the folder lightly. "It was a loan," she said. "And since I helped you two get this place, I should be able to move in. A house built on a mother's support shouldn't forget the mother." She smiled, with that polite tightness meant to disguise intention. Then she added, "That's just tradition. Courtesy." Her fingers rested on the folder like it was proof, even though she'd brought no documents, just confidence, history, and a practiced sense of obligation. The refrigerator hummed a faint note, as if the appliances were listening in on the negotiation. I folded my hands. Then we just need the correct term. Was it a gift or a loan? My tone didn't rise or drift. If it was a loan, there must be a contract, payment schedule, interest, something in writing. The porch light flickered once outside, almost synchronized with her blink. I didn't push further, no accusations, no sentiment. The request for clarity itself became the boundary. She looked at me like she hadn't expected the question, like precision was an inconvenience, not a requirement. My husband hovered behind her, pretending to check a text. He wasn't reading anything. His thumb just hovered over the screen, retreating from the moment the way someone steps back from a flame. I caught the short breath he tried to hide, an exhale that carried discomfort and loyalty pulling in opposite directions. I opened a small notepad beside me and wrote one word: loan. Then I drew a line under it, not for emphasis, but to mark exactly what had been said. Accuracy always mattered more than tone. She didn't notice the note. She only watched the folder, the way someone watches a door they hope will swing their way. The cover shifted slightly when she brushed against the table, stopping right at the edge, half hanging, half resting, as if deciding which side gravity belonged to. No one raised a voice, no threats, no dramatic gestures, just that barely there sound of the folder's corner touching wood, holding the entire room in a quiet, sharp balance. The next morning, before the sun had fully lifted over the street, I sat at the kitchen counter with my laptop open and a mug cooling beside me. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that sharpens focus. I signed into the bank portal, navigating past the usual security screens, then began searching transaction history. I filtered by date, by amount, by any descriptor that could point back to the transfer she insisted on calling a loan. My fingers hovered for a moment before clicking the Advanced Search tab. The word I typed, contribution, felt almost sterile compared to what it represented. The loading wheel spun, reflecting off the glossy surface of the counter like a little silver coin deciding which side to land on. A result appeared. A single line among hundreds, a transfer from her account labeled gift contribution. I stared at the phrase long enough for my coffee to lose its steam. The word wasn't vague or metaphorical. It was administrative, bank-coded, cold in its clarity. I clicked into the details, enlarging the transaction window. There it was again. Gift. The precision of that one word created a small pause in my chest. I downloaded the PDF, watching it appear in my toolbar. Naming the file felt strangely ceremonial. I saved it under the exact date of the transfer, all numbers and underscores. I opened the PDF to double-check every line: sender, recipient, timestamp, coding. Then I took screenshots, ensuring the labels and metadata were visible without distortion. I zoomed in until the letters looked carved into the screen. When I was satisfied nothing could be misread or dismissed, I printed 2 copies and slicked them into a plastic sleeve on the table beside me. My phone buzzed with a calendar alert. Just a reminder to hydrate, ironically, but the sound snapped the moment into place. Evidence wasn't dramatic, it was orderly. It didn't raise voices, it organized them. I attached the screenshots to an email drafted to our banker and typed a short request. Please confirm that this transfer was coded as a gift, not a loan. My finger hovered over the send button for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement. This was the kind of step no one could argue with. I added the PDF as well, reorganized the attachments by name, then pressed send. The message left with a quiet whoosh that blended into the hum of the refrigerator. I leaned back in the chair, letting the morning settle around me. Before closing my laptop, I created a folder on my desktop, labeled Home Documentation, then mirrored the structure in a physical folder at my side. I flagged the bank materials with a single red sticker for easy reference. Then, almost as a reflex, I texted my husband. When you're free, we need to shift all discussions with your mom to writing. Just for clarity. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. He finally replied. Okay. No elaboration, no questions. Just a small acknowledgement that felt like a step, even if it was a quiet one. With everything organized, I slid the printed documents into the physical folder and closed it gently. The cardboard made a soft thud, steady and final. I placed it upright against the backsplash, where the morning light traced along its spine. In the stillness of the kitchen, that little sound, that tiny weight of paper, felt like the beginning of a map, one that would matter far more than any raised voice or emotional appeal. Late that afternoon, while taking out a small bag of recycling, I ran into one of our neighbors, a quiet man who tended his lawn with the same devotion people reserve for firstborns. He mentioned almost casually that the HOA had circulated new reminders about occupancy rules. "Just a heads up," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Anyone staying more than 30 days has to be registered. They've started checking." His tone wasn't nosy, just procedural. The way people talk when they assume you already know the details of your own home. I nodded, but the information lodged itself deeper than he probably intended. When I went back inside, the house felt colder, as if the walls had absorbed his words. I stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the sink, replaying the conversation. It wasn't the rule itself that bothered me. It was how those rules would clash with the assumptions my mother-in-law was already making. A home had policies, a family had boundaries, and those two structures were about to collide. I went upstairs to my small workspace and pulled up the HOA documents from the community portal. The PDF loaded slowly, as though even the system knew the pages carried weight. I scrolled to the sections about long-term guests, highlighting phrases that spelled out what counted as residency. Registration forms, background checks, prior approval from the board. The language was dry, almost bureaucratic, but the implications were sharp. I printed the relevant pages, the machine humming steadily beside me. When the papers came out warm and faintly scented with toner, I stacked them neatly and circled a section on the second page, one that stated the HOA could issue fines or formally intervene for unregistered occupants. Not dramatic, but measurable. I slipped the printouts under my arm and headed back downstairs, thinking of how every rule in this neighborhood had a paper trail, a timestamp, a process. Nothing ran on unspoken expectations. At the dining table, I reread the rules again, slower this time. My mother-in-law's plan to move in wasn't just a family dispute. It intersected with structural obligations no one could wish away. If she walked through our door with her suitcase, the HOA would expect paperwork. They would expect signatures, notice, compliance. And none of that matched her version of the story, the one where a loan granted her silent access to the home. I imagined the tension of trying to enforce rules after the fact, the awkwardness of explaining to the board that the conflict was rooted in shifting definitions and emotional leverage. The more I pictured it, the more urgent clarity became. I slid the printed pages into the physical folder on the kitchen counter, labeling them with a small sticky note that read, "Policy." It was a simple word, but it kept the situation grounded in structure instead of sentiment. Once everything was organized, I sat down and composed a short text to my husband. "From here on, let's keep all discussions with your mom in writing. I'll respond clearly and respectfully, but I need documentation of what's said." It wasn't a threat, just procedure, the same way one lines up receipts before filing taxes. He read it quickly. I could tell from the read receipt popping up almost instantly, but he didn't reply right away. Eventually, "Sure, that's fine." A small sentence, neutral, but not resistant. I placed the phone face down and tapped the folder lightly, feeling the shape of the papers beneath the cover. The house remained quiet, the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the breath before a meeting begins. I took one last look at the policy pages, then closed the folder and placed it in the center of the dining table. I opened my laptop and reorganized the digital files, bank evidence, email drafts, and now the HOA regulations. Each category had its own subfolder, each subfolder its own numbered files. It reminded me of the way libraries categorize books, not by emotion but by logic, by how one piece of information connects to the next. As I dragged documents into the correct places, the cursor moved with a kind of mechanical precision that quieted my mind. I cross-checked the printed copies to ensure nothing was missing. Then I sent an email to myself with all attachments in a zipped folder, a small habit I'd developed after losing a hard drive once. When the email landed in my inbox, I felt a calm, procedural satisfaction. Preparation wasn't dramatic. It was patient. And patience, I knew, was its own form of defense. Before closing the laptop, I stood up and adjusted the folder on the table, so it sat perfectly parallel to the wood grain. It wasn't about neatness. It was about readiness. The ceiling fan above creaked softly, 3 slow rotations before pausing with a tiny click that echoed faintly through the dining room. I listened to the sound, steady and unhurried, like a timestamp on the moment. Nothing explosive had happened. No confrontation, no raised voices, no sudden declarations. Just quiet preparation, quiet rules, quiet facts. Yet the air held a sense of movement, the subtle shift that happens when groundwork begins to take shape. I rested my hand on the back of a chair and took a breath that reached all the way down. Then I turned off the lights, letting the house dim around the folder that waited calmly on the table. She arrived earlier than expected, standing on the porch with a posture that suggested she'd been rehearsing the moment. When I opened the door, the porch light flickered twice, casting a thin pulse of gold across her coat. She didn't comment on it, neither did I. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes sweeping the entryway as if taking inventory. "I need the spare key," she said, setting her purse down like she already belonged here. The way she spoke wasn't confrontational, it was logistical, as if she were requesting a receipt or a refill. But the air between us tightened by a degree, the way fabric pulls when you straighten a seam. I closed the door quietly and moved just enough to face her fully. The flicker from outside left a faint afterimage in the room, a reminder of how quickly light can change. She positioned herself near the hallway, where the house opened into the living room. "It'll make things easier," she said. "I'll be coming by more often and it's inconvenient to wait outside, or to call." There was a softness to her tone, but it was the kind of softness used to cushion an expectation, not invite discussion. She rested a hand on the wall, tracing the edge of a photo frame with a sense of ownership that didn't match the paperwork. I watched her fingertips move, each small gesture suggesting a future she already assumed was set in motion. The request for a key wasn't a question. It was a declaration wrapped in courtesy. She waited, still tracing the frame, as if the silence itself would lean in her favor. I stepped closer, keeping my voice even. "We can talk about access, but not until we have clarity." Her hand paused. "Clarity about what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Whether the money was a gift or a loan," I said. "A spare key would imply shared residency. Residency follows rules, and rules follow definitions." The sentence hung between us, simple but unyielding. She lowered her hand from the frame, her expression shifting just enough to reveal irritation beneath the polite exterior. "You're being stiff," she murmured, as though practicality were a flaw. But I didn't move. I didn't soften. I just stood there, letting the distinction settle. Not aggressive, not emotional, just accurate. She straightened her coat. "I raised your husband. I helped you buy this house. Courtesy goes 2 ways. Her voice carried the kind of logic families use to bypass boundaries. Nostalgia, sacrifice, lineage. But courtesy in her framing sounded more like leverage than kindness. "Courtesy is easier when terms are clear," I replied. "If it was a loan, there should be a contract, payment schedule, something in writing." She blinked, a subtle break in her rhythm, then recovered with a thin smile. "In this family, we don't need paperwork," she said. It was a confident statement, but it wobbled slightly at the end, like something held up by memory rather than structure. I waited. Hands relaxed at my sides, giving her no friction to push against. She shifted her weight, glancing toward the kitchen as if wanting to anchor the moment to a space she saw as shared. "You're overthinking," she said. "You should trust me." The word trust slid out smoothly but not cleanly. I do trust you, I answered. That's why I want everything accurate. I picked up the folder from the dining table, not opening it, simply holding it by the spine. Her eyes followed the motion. Gift or loan? I asked again, without elevation or pressure. She took a slow breath, the kind people take when recalibrating. Her gaze drifted toward the door, then back to me, then to the folder again. She didn't answer the question. Instead, she wrapped her coat tighter around herself, choosing silence as a placeholder. I walked her to the door, neither of us filling the quiet with anything performative. She stepped outside and paused, her silhouette framed by the porch light, which flickered once more before steadying. I just hope you remember who helped you, she said, almost gently. I didn't respond. The statement wasn't a request, just a reminder of the hierarchy she preferred. I closed the door slowly, the latch clicking into place with a deliberate finality. Inside, the house felt still, as though it had absorbed the entire exchange into its walls. The folder remained in my hand, its weight modest but unmistakable. The air settled around me, quiet but firm, as I set it back on the table and exhaled once, long and controlled. That evening, while I was rinsing dishes, I overheard my husband on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, but the words traveled easily through the open doorway. His mother was recounting the sacrifice she'd made for the house, her tone carefully balanced between wounded and proud. I could hear her emphasizing the phrase, down payment loan, repeating it softly, rhythmically, as if repetition could transform memory into truth. My husband murmured reassurances, nothing definite, just vague threads meant to calm her. The dishwater grew still around my hands as I listened, not because I was intruding, but because their conversation was already shaping decisions I would eventually be held responsible for. When he ended the call, the small click of his phone setting down on the table felt heavier than it should. I dried my hands slowly, giving the moment room to exist before addressing it. He walked into the kitchen with a conflicted look settling across his features. Maybe we should just ease up a little, he said quietly. The words weren't accusatory, just tentative, like stepping onto a floor he wasn't sure would hold his weight. He rubbed the back of his neck, a familiar gesture he used whenever he wanted peace more than clarity. I leaned against the counter, studying him. Not as an opponent, not as an ally, but as someone caught between roles. Easing up on what? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He hesitated. She feels shut out. Maybe it's not worth the tension. He wasn't trying to pick a side. He was trying to avoid having to pick one at all. But avoidance, I knew, had its own consequences. I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough to unsettle the instinct to argue. We can give her respect. We can give her time with our future kids. We can give her space in our lives. But we can't give her definitions that aren't true. He looked up, eyes flicking briefly toward the dining table where the folder rested, as if it were a quiet witness. I'm not trying to fight, I continued. I just don't want either of us to agree to something out of guilt. This is our home. We owe her kindness, not confusion. His shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat but in recognition. He reached for my hand, but the gesture faltered halfway before he let it fall. The honesty sat between us, still and necessary. He nodded slowly. Okay. Maybe we put everything in writing then, he said, almost to himself, to avoid misunderstandings. His voice steadied a little as he spoke the words. It was the first time he had aligned with process rather than sentiment. I walked to the table, opened my laptop, and created an email draft addressed to both him and his mother. This is just a recap, I said, typing out a clear summary of the conversation we'd had with her. No accusations, no interpretations, no emotional color, just facts. I watched him read over my shoulder, his breathing evening out as the structure replaced the chaos.
When the draft was finished, I added a single subject line: terminology clarification. He didn't object. In fact, he exhaled a quiet, almost relieved breath, as though the simplicity of the wording gave him something to lean on. I sent the email,
The digital swoosh marking the first time all three of us were aligned in one documented place. He rested his hands on the back of a chair, tracing the wood grain with his thumb. "I want things to be calm," he said. "I know," I replied. "Clarity helps with that." We didn't hug, didn't debate further. We just stood in the soft light of the kitchen, acknowledging the quiet shift. Later, when the house had settled into its nighttime hush, I closed the laptop and set it aside. The folder on the table remained closed, but its presence carried a steadiness that hadn't been there before. I touched the edge lightly, not to seek reassurance but to confirm readiness. The silence felt different now, not tense, not uncertain, but organized. When I turned off the lights and walked toward the stairs, I glanced once more at the table. The room held its stillness, as if bracing for the next conversation, the next email, the next inch of progress won, not through argument, but through precision. Then I climbed the steps, each footfall soft, carrying the quiet forward into the night. The next morning, the house was still dim when I turned on the small desk lamp in my workspace. The printer sat quietly beneath it, a boxy machine that rarely drew attention. But when I pressed the power button, it hummed to life with an almost purposeful vibration. I cued the bank documents, and the printer began feeding sheets through, each one emerging warm and faintly scented with ink. The steady sound, rrr, pause, rrr, filled the room with a mechanical reassurance. I watched the first page slide out, crisp and unambiguous, the transaction details printed clearly across the top. I placed the pages on the desk, smoothing them with my hand. The morning light had not fully reached the hallway, and the soft glow from the lamp made the paper edges look more defined than they were. Precision had a texture, a presence. I gathered the printed pages and arranged them in order, then used a small stapler to secure each set at the corner. Numbers in black ink marked each page, 1 of 5, 2 of 5, and so on. I double-checked the alignment, ensuring the stack felt clean and intentional. There was something grounding about the physicality of it, the way paper carried weight more honestly than spoken words. On the floor beside me, a small recycling bin waited for misprints, but today there were none. I slipped the final set into a clear sleeve, pressing the air out so it lay perfectly flat. The sound of plastic sealing around paper was quiet, but definitive. A tiny affirmation that preparation was not just an act, it was a stance. At the dining table, I opened the physical folder and created 3 labeled sections using thin adhesive tabs: bank, policy, and communication. Each tab caught the light slightly when I angled the folder, like small markers guiding a path. I slid the new documents under the bank section, aligning the edges neatly. Then I wrote a short index on a single sheet: dates, descriptions, file names, so nothing would be unclear later. The simple act of labeling brought order to the situation in a way conversations had not. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood, but the stillness didn't bother me. It made each small action feel deliberate, almost ceremonial. The folder now had structure, and structure had its own kind of calm. I opened my laptop and drafted a brief message to our attorney. Attached are the bank documents confirming the transfer, requesting a review of ownership, contribution, and any implications regarding residency. I kept the tone neutral, no frustration, no defensiveness, just the facts. I added the PDFs, double-checking that none of them were outdated or mislabeled. Before hitting send, I read the email aloud softly, making sure every word held up. The room carried my voice back in a faint echo, quiet but clear. When I finally pressed send, the message left the screen with a small, digital flutter. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the moment settle the way dust does after a shifted book on a shelf. Before putting everything away, I snapped a clear photo of the folder, its color, its tabs, the neat rows of sleeves inside. I emailed the picture to myself with a simple subject line, backup. Then I repeated the process with the digital files, uploading them to cloud storage and enabling two-factor authentication. It wasn't paranoia. It was redundancy, the quiet backbone of preparation. My phone buzzed briefly with a verification code, and then again with a confirmation that the files were secured. I powered it off afterward, letting the silence return. In that moment, every action felt like placing a brick in a foundation meant to withstand pressure. Not dramatic pressure, but steady, insistent pressure. When I finally sat down, the folder resting closed on the table. The overhead light cast a soft reflection across its surface. I traced the reflection with my gaze, noting how steady it looked now compared to earlier in the week. I didn't open the folder again. There was no need. Its readiness created a quiet sense of direction. I slid it toward the center of the table, where it caught the last bit of morning light. The edge glowed faintly, not with importance, but with order. And for the first time in days, the house felt like something I was steering rather than bracing against. I took a slow breath, letting the calm settle in, steady and full. The attorney responded shortly before noon, his email concise and neutral. Attached was a checklist outlining the basic requirements that would define a legitimate loan. Written agreement, interest terms, repayment schedule, collateral. 4 items, each one empty. I printed the checklist, the paper emerging with a firmness that made the absence of any supporting documents feel even starker. Standing at the counter, I let my eyes trace each line slowly. The house was quiet, except for the refrigerator's low hum, but the silence made the clarity louder. A loan wasn't an idea or an intention. It was a structure, and her version of events didn't have any beams holding it up. The checklist lay open on the table like a neutral observer waiting for entries that didn't exist. The second attachment described the requirements for a financial gift: a bank-coded transfer, a letter of intent, documentation for tax purposes. 3 items, all present or easily proven. I underlined each point with a thin pen, the ink gliding smoothly across the page. The logic wasn't emotional. It didn't need to negotiate or soothe. It simply organized reality. I placed the printed pages beside the folder and considered how differently this situation might feel if everyone involved valued clarity the same way. The attorney's note at the bottom was brief. Confirm any written correspondence indicating repayment expectations. I exhaled slowly, knowing there were none. Not even a hint. I began drafting questions for the upcoming meeting with the attorney, typing each one with the same deliberate pace I used when labeling files. Any documentation from her requesting repayment. Any written statements implying debt. Any precedent for claiming residency based on financial contribution. Each line landed cleanly on the page, crisp and evenly spaced. The act of writing helped separate the emotional noise from the legal structure underneath. When I finished, I printed the list and slipped it into the communications section of the folder. I pressed lightly along the spine to settle the pages. The room felt still, as though the house itself recognized the alignment forming inside that folder. I created a new digital folder titled Attorney and moved the relevant documents inside, adding a short note summarizing the situation. Dates, transactions, statements. I encrypted the folder, not because I expected conflict, but because protecting documentation felt like part of the discipline of truth. When I was done, I sent a short reminder to my husband. Please review the attorney checklist before we meet. The message delivered instantly, but his response took a few minutes. I'll read everything tonight, he wrote. It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't avoidance either. It was steady, which was enough. I closed my phone and returned my attention to the physical paperwork waiting on the table. Later that afternoon, I stood in the hallway mirror practicing the sentence the attorney had emphasized. A gift does not create residency rights. Saying it aloud felt strange at first, like rehearsing for a performance I never wanted to give. But repetition smoothed the edges, turning the words into something almost instinctive. I tried the sentence again, quieter this time. Then once more without looking at my reflection. Each repetition was less about confrontation and more about steadiness, being able to speak clearly when the air between us tightened again. I placed the printed checklist on top of the folder and tapped it once, acknowledging the growing coherence of our position. I returned to the dining table and reviewed everything one last time. The bank documentation, the HOA rules, the email recaps, the attorney checklist. It all fit together with a calm, almost architectural logic. When I closed the folder, the snap of the cover felt gentle but absolute. The sunlight outside shifted across the table, drifting from warm yellow to a paler shade, catching the edge of the folder in a thin, steady line. I rested my hand flat against the cover, letting the steadiness settle into my palm. Nothing dramatic had happened, but the groundwork was unmistakably solid now. The next step would come soon, and I felt ready for it. Dinner that night carried an uneasy quiet long before she spoke. She had arrived with a small bag of fruit and the kind of smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. We sat around the table, 3 plates, 3 glasses, 3 attempts at normalcy. Midway through the meal, she set her fork down, folded her napkin carefully, and said, "Next week, I'll move in. It's time." The words landed with a clean, sharp weight. A spoon slipped from my husband's hand, tapping the tile in a sound that broke the room's balance. She didn't flinch. She looked at me with a calm certainty, as though the decision had been signed somewhere I had no access to. The air felt suddenly dense, as if the whole room leaned forward waiting for my response. I picked up my glass, letting the chilled surface ground me before speaking. "On what basis?" I asked, my tone steady and unhurried. Her brows lifted, as if surprised that the question even existed. "On the basis of the loan," she said. "The down payment I provided." She delivered the line as though announcing a fact everyone already agreed upon. My husband shifted in his seat, the subtle scrape of wood against tile sounding louder than it should. I didn't look at him. Watching his reaction wouldn't help either of us. Instead, I placed my hands lightly on the table and maintained eye contact with her, not out of challenge, but out of precision. Truth had its own posture. She leaned back, crossing her arms as if preparing for negotiation. "I helped pay for this house. That gives me the right to stay here," she continued. The certainty in her voice didn't match the emptiness of the documentation, but emotional confidence often outruns evidence. I nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the sentence without accepting the premise. "If it is a loan," I said evenly, "there must be a loan agreement. The attorney asked for it. We'll need you to provide that." Her expression tightened, the kind of reaction that happens when a familiar narrative meets unexpected structure. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, recalibrating. The silence between us felt stretched but intact. I reached for my phone and opened a new email draft addressed to her. "We need the loan agreement by 9 tonight," I said, eyes still on her. "Any terms, any documentation, anything that supports what you're saying." My husband swallowed hard, the motion small but noticeable. She pressed her lips together, perhaps realizing that this wasn't a debate, it was a request for evidence. "You're putting deadlines on your own family," she asked quietly. "Deadlines keep everyone aligned," I replied. "It avoids confusion later." She didn't argue further. She simply inhaled sharply, a controlled breath meant to cover disappointment, and reached for her glass. No one ate much after that. The steam rising off the plates thinned, then disappeared entirely. She pushed her food around with her fork, her appetite replaced by calculation. My husband cleared his throat once, as if searching for a neutral sentence that never came. I stayed still, watching the clock on the microwave tick forward with unhurried precision. There was no anger in the room, no raised voices, just a quiet pressure that shaped the air. At one point she looked toward the hallway, maybe imagining her future room, maybe rethinking the evening altogether. But she didn't voice any part of that thought. When she finally stood to leave, the legs of her chair scraped softly against the tile. She gathered her bag slowly, as though waiting for someone to soften the moment on her behalf. No one did. The front door closed behind her with a muted thud, and the house exhaled in her absence. I looked at the untouched plates, the cooled food, the faint mark on the floor where the spoon had fallen. The room hadn't erupted. Nothing had broken. Yet something had shifted, a boundary tightening in quiet increments. I stood, collected the dishes, and let the stillness finish settling over the evening like a final layer of dust. 9 o'clock came and went with a quiet that felt intentional. I refreshed my inbox twice, then a third time. Each click returning the same empty screen. No documents, no attachments, not even a message saying she needed more time. The absence itself felt like an answer. I set the phone face down on the table and sat back in my chair, listening to the faint hum of the dishwasher cycling in the kitchen. The house held a kind of suspended stillness, as though waiting for me to mark this moment properly. A deadline unmet wasn't dramatic, but it was defining. I lifted the phone again, checking one last time before midnight edged closer. Still nothing. The quiet settled deeper. A few minutes later, a single message appeared. Short, unsentimental. In this family, a mother's word is the paper. She had phrased it like a proverb, something inherited rather than improvised. I read it twice, letting the meaning settle in its full shape. My thumb hovered above the screen before I took a screenshot, ensuring the timestamp was visible. Documentation didn't discriminate between what someone wished were true and what actually was. I saved the image in the communication folder, labeling it with the date and time. Then I placed the phone back on the table, the screen dimming, as if the house had turned away from the notion she'd tried to submit. I began drafting a reply. Nothing confrontational, nothing emotional, just structured clarity. Please provide written evidence of the loan terms when available. The language matched the attorney's template exactly. No deviations, no invitations to reinterpret history. I read the message aloud once before sending, making sure it landed cleanly, devoid of heat or hesitation. When it left my screen, the whoosh felt almost surgical. Precise, clean, final. I leaned back, letting the repetition of order dissolve whatever tension lingered in my fingers. It wasn't about winning. It was about preserving the record. I flagged the entire email thread in red, potential evidence. The label felt almost redundant now that every interaction had become part of a larger pattern, but organization was its own kind of calm. My husband had remained quiet through the evening, his silence a mix of discomfort and observation. He lingered in the doorway for a moment, as if considering whether to say something, but he didn't. Instead, he crossed the room and sat across from me, elbows on the table, staring at the phone as if expecting it to speak for her. I didn't comment. His silence didn't need interpretation, it just needed space. I wrote a small line in my notebook. No documentation provided by deadline. Then underneath it, I drew a thin line and wrote, Statement in lieu of evidence. Mother's word is the paper. The plainness of the sentence felt weightier in ink. Facts, when paired with time, gain texture. Truth gains weight. I closed the notebook gently, letting the pen rest between the pages. A part of me wondered whether she had expected the deadline to dissolve on its own, softened by family dynamics. But deadlines don't dissolve. Relationships do when clarity is avoided long enough. The digital clock on the oven clicked to 9:12 p.m., its soft mechanical rhythm filling the room. I stared at the glowing numbers for a moment, absorbing the simplicity of time doing what people often refuse to: move forward without apology. I powered off my phone and placed it on the counter. Nothing dramatic had unfolded. No shouting, no slammed doors, no ultimatum. Just the quiet confirmation that absence can speak louder than effort. The house, still and observant, seemed to file the moment away with me. I stood, turned off the lights, and let the darkness settle neatly around the edges of the night. The next morning, while sorting through older emails for unrelated work, I stumbled on a thread from our banker, something I'd archived months ago without opening the attachments. The subject line was plain, almost unremarkable: transfer confirmation and gift documentation. My pulse steadied as I clicked into it. The message was brief, polite, procedural. Below it, a PDF sat waiting like a sealed envelope I'd forgotten to open. I downloaded the file and let it load slowly, the progress bar inching forward with the quiet weight of something significant. When it finally opened, the first word stared back with cold clarity: "This is a non-repayable gift." The air around me seemed to pause, as if even the house needed a moment to absorb the sentence. I scrolled through the document carefully. Her signature sat clearly at the bottom, penned in her unmistakable handwriting. The date matched the week we'd made the purchase. The letter was crisp, unambiguous, structured in the formal format banks required for tax and underwriting purposes. Reading it felt strangely surreal, like discovering a perfectly preserved artifact that contradicted a story everyone else insisted on retelling. I printed the letter in color, letting the heavier paper feed through the printer with slow, deliberate movements. When the copy emerged, I stamped the top corner with a small label: "Copy." The ink settled instantly. Evidence didn't tremble the way people did. As I crossed the living room with the printed gift letter in hand, she appeared at the doorway, unexpected and unannounced. She reached for the folder on the table with a quick, automatic motion, as though the paperwork inside belonged to her by default. The suddenness of it startled me. The sleeve containing the gift letter slipped from my hand and skidded across the floor. For a brief second, both of us froze. Then I knelt, collected the pages, and stood slowly, steadying the document in my grip before she could reclaim the moment. My hand trembled at first, a reflex, but the shaking settled with each breath I took. She demanded, "What are you doing with those papers?" Her tone carried more urgency than accusation, but the boundary was thin. I held the letter in front of me, not aggressively, not triumphantly, just plainly. "Reviewing documentation," I replied. I moved past her and returned to the table, placing the pages down deliberately. She stepped closer, eyes scanning the text without permission, without patience. When her gaze reached the line she had once signed, "Non-repayable," her lips tightened into a silent line. The words were hers, but the ownership of truth was no longer negotiable. She straightened but said nothing. I read the sentence aloud, calm and controlled. "This is a non-repayable gift." The room held the sound in an even, steady grip. 5 seconds passed, slow, almost ceremonial. She looked away first. My husband entered then, drawn by the tension in the air. He saw the printed pages on the table and froze, recognition flickering in his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The document had spoken for all of us. She glanced at him, searching for rescue, but he remained still. Sometimes silence is the clearest stance a person can take. I placed the gift letter into a clear inner sleeve and slid it into the folder with deliberate care. The plastic sealed around it with a muted rustle, final and unyielding. She stood there for another moment, shoulders lifted slightly as though she were preparing a response that never fully formed. When she finally exhaled, the sound was quiet and frayed at the edges. I closed the folder gently, aligning its spine with the grain of the table. No one spoke, no voices rose. But the shift in the room was unmistakable, clean, exact, irreversible. By late afternoon, the banker replied to my request with the efficiency of someone who dealt in facts, not narratives. His email opened with a simple line. The transfer was coded as a gift. No qualifiers, no softening language. Attached were 3 PDFs, transaction details, coding confirmation, and a record verifying the bank's classification. I downloaded each file carefully, opening them one at a time. Every line was precise, leaving no room for reinterpretation. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the stove clock. But the clarity in the documents felt louder than any conversation we'd had about the house so far. I printed the attachments, the printer feeding each sheet smoothly into the output tray. When I laid them side by side on the table, they formed a neat arc of confirmation. Simple, unemotional, complete. I gathered the printed pages and sent them to my husband and his mother in a single forward, attaching the banker's original email for full transparency. I kept the message short, sharing the confirmation for everyone's reference. I added our attorney to the CC, ensuring the thread became part of the formal record. Within minutes, a reply from her arrived. The intention was a loan, she wrote. Nothing else. No explanation, no attachment, no acknowledgement of the banker's coding. Just a sentence, attempting to override documented fact with personal intent. I read it twice, then flagged it for the communication folder. Intention without structure had no legal weight, but it always carried emotional momentum. I felt the shift of that momentum, familiar, but no longer destabilizing. A few seconds later, our attorney responded directly in the thread. His reply was a single line, centered perfectly in the email body. Intent does not override documentation. The clarity of the sentence felt almost medicinal. My husband exhaled audibly from across the room. Not in victory, but in relief. Like someone realizing the ground beneath him was more solid than he feared. I watched him reread the line, his shoulders dropping as though a weight had been lifted off his posture. The attorney's message didn't escalate anything. It didn't accuse, shame, or provoke. It simply redirected the conversation back to the only place it could stand: the evidence. I printed the attorney's email as well, preserving it alongside the banker's attachments. When I slipped the sheets into the folder, they aligned cleanly with the existing documents, completing the sequence of proof. I took a moment to review the pages from start to finish. The gift letter, the bank coding, the attorney's clarification. Each document strengthened the next, forming a quiet chain of fact. My husband watched from the doorway, leaning one shoulder against the frame. "It's all there," he said softly. His voice didn't carry relief alone. It carried recognition. Recognition that the truth wasn't fragile. It was simply waiting to be seen clearly. I closed the folder and placed it upright on the table. The weight felt different now, less defensive, more anchored. My husband stepped closer and rested his hand on the back of a chair, a gesture that suggested he wanted to say something but wasn't certain where to begin. "This helps," he murmured finally. "It just does." I nodded, not needing more than that. Progress didn't always come in declarations. Sometimes it arrived in the smallest acknowledgments. He looked toward the front door, the direction she had left earlier, then down at the floor. "I didn't realize how much this was wearing on us," he said. His honesty was quiet, steady. I turned off the lamp, letting the last natural light of the day stretch across the table. The documents inside the folder no longer felt like ammunition. They felt like clarity, arranged in a sequence, a completeness. The house seemed to absorb the stillness, the air settling into something calmer than before. Nothing had been resolved emotionally, not yet, but the facts had aligned, and alignment has its own kind of peace. I touched the folder once, lightly, then stepped back. Evening settled against the windows, slow and even, as if acknowledging that the foundation of truth had finally taken its place, exactly where it belonged. The next morning I sat across from the clerk's window at the county office, watching the red date stamp descend onto each page with a firm, hollow thud. The sound echoed slightly in the narrow room, bouncing off glass and tile with a kind of bureaucratic finality. The clerk didn't ask questions. He simply verified the documents, stamped them, and slid them back under the glass with a practiced motion. Behind me, a child hummed quietly, waiting with his mother for some unrelated paperwork. But the small sound only anchored the moment further. I gathered the stamped pages, their corner still warm from the machine, and placed them neatly in my bag. Nothing about the exchange was dramatic, yet the imprint of that ink felt heavier than any argument we'd had at home. When we met with the attorney afterward, he reviewed the documents one by one, nodding as he read through the key lines. "This is sufficient," he said, placing the gift letter on top of the stack. "Gift, not loan. No residency rights implied." His voice carried no judgment, only structure. My husband sat beside me, hands folded, absorbing the clarity in silence. Across the table, the attorney tapped the pages lightly into alignment, then looked up. "You're standing on solid ground," he said. The simple affirmation caused the tension in my shoulders to ease by a fraction, a release I hadn't realized I'd been resisting. I suggested we schedule a three-way meeting, her, my husband, and me, with the attorney present. Not to argue, not to reprimand, but to document a single, unified version of the truth. A written summary at the end would help, I added. The attorney agreed, making a note in his calendar. My husband nodded, relieved, though the relief was cautious, like someone accepting the stability of a chair they weren't entirely sure could hold their full weight. The office felt steady, grounded, neutral in the best possible way. Facts have that effect. They don't soothe, but they simplify. As we prepared to leave, my husband's phone buzzed. It was her. He read the message, then turned the screen toward me. "I want the baby overnight on Tuesday. Just Tuesday," she had written. It was abrupt, strategically emotional. I exhaled, then looked at the attorney. He understood immediately. "Grandparent visitation can be separate," he said gently. "It does not intersect with ownership or residency." His reassurance wasn't icy or clinical. It was balanced, as if he'd seen this pattern unfold dozens of times. My husband rubbed the back of his neck, the gesture small but telling. We stepped into the hallway outside his office, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above us. "She keeps mixing everything together," my husband murmured. "It's how she negotiates," I said. "Emotion first, structure later." He nodded, the words landing with a small, reluctant acceptance. "We can separate them for her," I continued. "Visits with the baby are about relationship. Residency is about rights. They're not the same." He leaned against the wall for a moment, letting the distinction settle. Sometimes clarity wasn't a confrontation. It was a kind of mercy. Later, when we returned home, I placed the newly stamped documents into the folder with steady hands. The house was quiet, the afternoon light stretching across the table in long, pale stripes. I paused over the folder before closing it, not to admire it, but to acknowledge what had shifted. Structure was no longer something we were chasing. It was something we had. I locked the folder into the drawer and listened to the soft click of the latch. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was simply alignment. Cool, even, unmistakable. The conference room was small, its walls lined with muted artwork that seemed designed to neither comfort nor provoke. She sat across from the attorney, hands clasped tightly in her lap. My husband and I sat side by side, the folder resting closed on the table between us. The attorney began with a calm question. "Do you have a written loan agreement?" She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flicked toward my husband, then down at the table. The silence lingered long enough for the hum of the air conditioner to become noticeable. When she finally opened her mouth, nothing came out, only a shallow exhale. It wasn't defiance, it was absence, a space where proof should have lived, but didn't. The attorney continued, his tone steady and unpressured. "Any interest terms? Date of repayment? Collateral?" Each question was followed by another pressed pause. She smoothed the fabric of her skirt, her fingers moving with the restless precision of someone trying to reassemble a narrative that had already been dismantled. She answered nothing, not a word. My husband shifted slightly beside me, an involuntary movement that sounded louder than it was in the quiet room. 3 questions, 3 silences. They stacked themselves neatly, forming their own kind of answer. Facts don't demand volume, they demand presence. Her eyes moved to my husband again. "Say something," she whispered, soft but edged with expectation. My husband swallowed hard, his jaw tightening the way it did when he was trying to remain neutral. He looked down at his hands, then at the folder, then finally at her. His words came carefully. "Mom, we're just asking for what the process requires." The sentence was quiet, but it carried a steadiness I hadn't seen in him earlier in this conflict. She blinked rapidly, the shift in dynamic subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't losing control. She was losing narrative certainty. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice level. "We respect everything you've done for us, truly. But we have to follow the facts. It protects everyone." The attorney nodded in affirmation, hands folded neatly on the table. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression a blend of surprise and frustration, as if she had expected me to waver, to soften, to bend out of familial habit. Instead, I simply met her gaze and waited, not confrontational, not apologetic, just steady. She shifted in her chair, one hand tightening around the strap of her purse. She finally stood, adjusting her posture, searching for somewhere to place her certainty. "I just wanted to help," she said, voice trembling at the edges. "I didn't think I'd have to prove anything to my own family." The attorney replied gently, "Documentation isn't a challenge to your generosity, it's clarity." Her shoulders dropped a fraction, the kind of small surrender that comes not from defeat, but from recognition. She reached into her purse as if expecting to find something, anything, that might serve as evidence, but her hand emerged empty. She pressed her lips together and inhaled through her nose, steadying herself. I suggested a short break, offering her space to regroup. The attorney agreed and stepped out to retrieve additional forms we might need. My husband stood to refill his water, leaving the room momentarily unbalanced in its quiet. She remained seated, staring at the polished surface of the table, where her reflection appeared faint and wavering. For the first time in weeks, the tension between us wasn't charged, it was simply present, like a truth unfolding on its own timeline. I watched her breathe, slow and uneven, and waited without rushing her. Resolution wasn't supposed to be dramatic. Sometimes it was just an exhale, followed by the next necessary step. When the attorney returned, he placed a simple document on the table, a memorandum of understanding, blank except for the structural outline. "This is not a contract," he explained. "It's a written agreement to prevent future confusion." I slid the paper toward her gently. "We'd like to set clear expectations," I said. "No additional keys issued. No unapproved residency. Decisions go through written communication." She stared at the page, her fingers hovering above it as though contact might confirm something she wasn't ready to accept. The room felt still, but not tense, just paused, waiting for the next honest step. She drew a slow breath and lowered her gaze to the list, reading each line as if it were a boundary she had never expected to face. I added a second section dedicated to visitation. Defined days, defined hours, a consistent rhythm. "If you want more time with the baby, we can discuss it," I said, "but through email so everyone's clear." My voice wasn't firm or soft, just centered. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture of disquiet. "So I have to schedule time now?" she asked. My husband nodded. "It keeps things fair for all of us." She didn't argue, but the shift in her expression showed her mind working rapidly, adjusting a narrative she'd long kept unspoken. She traced a fingertip down the margin of the page, following the structure that now gently but unmistakably defined the path forward. I pointed to the third section. "This part is important. No references to the down payment in future disagreements." She lifted her head at that, eyes narrowing just enough to reveal resistance. "It was my money," she said quietly. "And your generosity isn't erased," I replied. "But using it as leverage harms all of us." The attorney spoke next, his tone neutral. "This clause prevents misunderstandings. It keeps financial gifts from becoming emotional bargaining chips." She looked between the two of us, the logic sinking in one small degree at a time. She didn't agree verbally, but her silence shifted from defensive to contemplative. We added one more point: consequences for violations. Not punishment, just accountability. "If boundaries are crossed," I said, "we pause visits for 2 weeks, then reset." She blinked, startled not by the firmness, but by the fairness. "You'd still let me see the baby afterward?" she asked. My husband leaned forward, voice steady. "Of course. This isn't about cutting you out. It's about making things predictable." Her shoulders softened, the first visible sign that she understood these guidelines weren't walls, they were guardrails. The attorney slid a pen toward her, its metallic click sounding louder than intended in the quiet room. I emailed her a digital copy of the draft, naming the file MOU Draft-V1, then printed a clean paper version and placed it before her. She read it again, slower this time, absorbing each clause with a seriousness that hadn't been present earlier. There was no accusation in the air, no battle to win, only a structure taking shape through mutual restraint. She tapped the edge of the paper lightly, a rare gesture of thoughtfulness. My husband watched her with a quiet hope, not for victory, but for understanding. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, settling into a steady glow that matched the room's tone. The attorney collected the forms we no longer needed and stepped aside to scan the new draft. The soft mechanical hum filled the silence as the scanner light passed over the page. When the machine beeped, he returned, setting the fresh copy on the table. "Review this tonight," he said. "We can sign the final version tomorrow." She nodded, not defeated, not triumphant, simply acknowledging the shift. I slid the draft into the folder, aligning it with the other documents already forming the backbone of our boundaries. The room exhaled with us, not in relief but in readiness. The next afternoon, we met again in the attorney's conference room. She arrived a few minutes early, settling into the same chair as before, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. The rhythm was slow and even, but it carried an undercurrent, like someone keeping themselves steady by marking time. I placed the folder on the table, closed and centered, and waited without filling the silence. My husband sat beside me, hands clasped, gaze lowered as though conserving emotional bandwidth. When the attorney entered, he greeted us calmly, acknowledging the draft we'd reviewed the day before. She stopped tapping only when he placed the updated document in front of her. The pause felt small but intentional. She picked up the MOU, her thumb smoothing the corner of the page before she began reading. I watched her eyes move across each line, slowly at first, then with increasing focus. I kept the folder close, my hand resting lightly on its edge, a quiet reminder that the facts lived inside it, unchanged. She reached the visitation clause, hesitated, then read it again. My husband breathed out softly beside me, not nervously, but as though bracing for an emotional recoil that didn't come. The room held the faint sound of her nails brushing the paper, a private metronome, keeping pace with the negotiation we weren't voicing. My husband leaned forward, voice steady but small. "I just want peace," he said. His mother looked at him for a long moment, the expression in her eyes shifting from frustration to something quieter. Fatigue, maybe. "I'm not trying to make life difficult," she murmured. "I just expected things to be simpler." He nodded, not apologizing, not retreating, just acknowledging. The attorney began walking through each clause, asking if she had questions. She didn't. Instead, she traced a fingertip along the line about scheduled visits, pausing only when she reached the section about boundaries. Her silence wasn't resistance, it was consideration. When the attorney asked for confirmation on each point, she responded with small nods. Not confident, not defeated, just measured. He made notes as she answered, ensuring the official record reflected agreement, clause by clause. When he reached the final item, she hesitated, her lips parting slightly. 2 evenings a month, she repeated. And exceptions for holidays? My husband nodded. Of course, we added that yesterday. She inhaled through her nose, letting the air settle before giving a quiet yes. The attorney marked the page with a final check, then folded his hands. "We can move to signatures on the final version tomorrow," he said softly. She adjusted her posture, sitting straighter, the tension in her shoulders easing by a fraction. "I appreciate being included," she said, her tone softer than it had been in weeks. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to one that fit her. My husband offered a small smile, the kind that didn't erase conflict but acknowledged progress. I gathered the documents gently, aligning their edges before sliding them into the folder. The click of the plastic sleeve settling over the papers felt like a quiet gesture of closure, temporary but real. We all stood at roughly the same time, pushing our chairs back with soft, uneven sounds. The attorney handed her a clean copy of the draft, suggesting she review it again at home. She slipped it into her purse carefully, as though it were fragile. As we stepped into the hallway, the ambient hum of the office returned, the photocopier running somewhere nearby, distant footsteps echoing in short patterns. Nothing dramatic lingered behind us, only the sense that something had shifted into a steadier alignment. My husband reached for my hand briefly, a small human gesture in a corridor of paperwork and process. And for the first time in a long while, the future felt organized. That evening, after we'd returned home, my phone lit up with a message from her. The screen glow cast a pale rectangle across the kitchen counter as I read the words. "I feel embarrassed. I didn't expect to be questioned like this." The message wasn't dramatic, but it carried an emotional tug she rarely revealed. I took a screenshot before opening our conversation thread, saving the image automatically to the communication folder. Then I reread her message slowly, letting its layers settle. Hurt, pride, uncertainty. I typed my reply deliberately, choosing each word with care. No one is trying to win. We're trying to make sure no one loses. My thumb hovered for a second before sending it. The language wasn't meant to soothe. It was meant to steady. Her response came quickly. A photo of an old check she had written years ago for an unrelated expense. The message beneath it reading, "This is what sacrifice looks like." She didn't say it unkindly. It felt more like an attempt to reclaim her narrative. I studied the image, noticing the date, the amount, the memo line that had nothing to do with the house. I opened the folder and pulled out the gift letter, placing it on the table next to my phone. The contrast was stark, emotion in one hand, documentation in the other. I attached the gift letter to my reply and wrote simply, "This is what clarity looks like." Not sharp, not cold, just true. I pressed send. A few minutes passed before she replied. "Fine. Let's finish the paperwork tomorrow," she wrote. The message lacked its usual flourish. My husband walked into the room then, drawn by the quiet glow of the screen. I handed him the phone, letting him read the exchange without commentary. He set it down gently, as if the device held something more fragile than data. "She's not angry," he said softly. "She's cornered." I shook my head. Not cornered, just confronted with facts. He exhaled long and low, the kind of breath people take when they realize the emotional center of a conflict has shifted. He sat beside me, elbows on the table absorbing the new tone of the evening. I drafted a short message proposing a firm time for the next day's meeting, 10 a.m. at the attorney's office. Before sending, I read it aloud to ensure the tone stayed measured. My husband nodded in agreement. "She'll be there," he said, not guessing, stating. He recognized the turning point, too. The conversation had moved from emotion to acceptance, from resistance to resolution. I checked the calendar on my laptop, blocking out the hour. The clean square on the screen felt symbolic, an appointment with clarity. I saved the update and closed the laptop gently, the lid clicking shut with a softness that echoed the mood in the room. She sent one last message before bed. "I know you're trying to protect your family. I just didn't think I needed protecting from my own intentions." I read it twice. There was vulnerability in it, disguised but present. I typed a brief answer. "We're protecting relationships, not against you, for all of us." Then I powered off my phone, letting the digital world go still. The quiet in the house felt different now. Not tense, not waiting, just steady. My husband rinsed 2 glasses in the sink, the soft clink of glass on porcelain blending with the low hum of the refrigerator. The ordinary sounds grounded the moment. Before heading upstairs, I placed the gift letter, the screenshots, and the correspondence from the day into the folder, aligning each page with practiced precision. The folder felt heavier now, not with conflict but with coherence. I slid it into the drawer and locked it, the click gentle and final. The house dimmed as we turned off the lights, each room settling into its own quiet. In the hallway, my husband touched my shoulder lightly, not a gesture of comfort but recognition. We climbed the stairs together step by step, the calm following us upward. Tomorrow would bring signatures, not arguments, process, not persuasion. And for the first time in a long time, that felt enough. The following morning we met again at the attorney's office. The room was bright with a cool, even light that made the documents on the table appear sharper than usual. She arrived quietly, without the tension or bravado that had shadowed earlier meetings. The attorney had already arranged the final papers in a neat stack, each page aligned with careful intention. My husband and I sat on one side, she on the other, the air between us steady but alert. She glanced at the documents, then at the attorney, waiting for instruction. He began by summarizing everything: the transfer, the coding, the gift letter, the previous agreements. The clarity was not new, but hearing it spoken aloud gave it a weight that written words rarely matched. She folded her hands, listening without interruption. The attorney slid the gift letter to the center of the table, reading the defining line once more. "This is a non-repayable gift." He did not emphasize the words, but their finality filled the room with a clear, unmistakable boundary. She stared at the sentence, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly settling into something like resignation mixed with understanding. "So that's it?" she asked. Her tone held no bitterness, just a quiet acceptance of what had been there all along. My husband leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "It means the house is ours, but you're still family." He didn't add anything more. The simplicity was enough. She hesitated, then looked directly at me. "What do I get to keep?" The question wasn't about money, it was about place, about role. I met her gaze not unkindly. "You keep being his mother, and our child's grandmother. Those things don't require residency, just relationship." The attorney nodded gently, reinforcing the distinction. Her shoulders softened, the lines around her eyes easing in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. She absorbed the answer slowly, as if trying it on for size, testing whether it could fit alongside the expectations she'd carried for so long. Nothing in her demeanor suggested triumph or defeat, only adjustment. The attorney turned to the visitation clauses, explaining each condition without embellishment. She listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification but not challenging the terms themselves. When he described the separation between financial contributions and parental decision-making, she nodded with a thin, thoughtful frown. "I don't want to lose my place in his life," she said softly. My husband reached across the table, resting his hand briefly near hers, not touching, but close enough to communicate what words often complicate. "You won't," he said. "But we all need boundaries." His tone was steady, neither pleading nor confrontational. She picked up the pen, examining it as though the instrument itself carried consequence. Her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it against the table. Without theatrics, she began signing each page. Slow strokes, deliberate, almost ceremonial. The sound of the pen moving across paper was soft but distinct, a quiet mark of commitment. When she reached the final page, she paused, then signed with a firmer motion. My husband added his signature next, his breath catching slightly. The room felt balanced, not harmonious, but aligned. When my turn came, I signed with a calm that reached all the way through my chest. The attorney gathered the pages, stacking them neatly before stamping the final page with a gentle, decisive press. She watched the stamp descend, then close her eyes briefly, as if letting the moment settle into a place she could accept. My husband looked at her, his expression soft, grateful, relieved. For the first time in weeks, no one was negotiating anything. No one was arguing, persuading, or defending. We were simply acknowledging the truth and shaping the future accordingly. The county clerk's window sat behind thick glass, the kind designed to separate emotion from procedure. I slid the finalized MOU and the stamped gift letter under the opening, watching the clerk lift each page with the practiced efficiency of someone who handled other people's conflicts daily. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need context. He simply aligned the edges, checked the signatures, and used a red date stamp that landed with a muted, satisfying weight. The ink glowed faintly against the paper. Clean, sharp, official. Behind me, people murmured in soft lines, waiting for their own paperwork to be validated. Building permits, marriage records, title updates. For a moment, everything felt appropriately scaled. Our conflict, our boundaries, our resolution. Just one more set of human arrangements passing through a neutral system designed to hold them without judgment. The clerk returned the documents with a small nod, sliding them back through the opening. The red imprint at the top corner felt almost warm in my hand. "All recorded," he said. There was something grounding in his tone, neither friendly nor distant, simply factual. I placed the stamped pages into the folder, lining them up with the other documents already arranged in chronological order. The structure was complete now, not in the emotional sense but in the procedural one. The official confirmation grounded everything we had built up to this point. My husband stood beside me, his posture visibly easing, shoulders lowering as though an invisible weight had finally been acknowledged by the world outside our home. When we stepped into the sunlight outside the building, the brightness felt almost abrupt. My husband shielded his eyes, blinking at the sudden contrast. "I didn't think clarity would feel like this," he said quietly. "Not dramatic, just steady." I held the folder close against my side. "That's the point," I replied. "Stability isn't loud." He nodded, exhaling in a slow, unguarded way. For weeks he had been caught between his mother's expectations and our family's boundaries, pulled by loyalties that didn't fit together. But now, walking toward the car with documents that aligned the narrative, I could feel the tension unspooling from him, in long, quiet threads. In the car I uploaded scans of the stamped documents to our private cloud, enabling multi-factor authentication on a new subfolder labeled County Records. I double-checked the upload twice before closing the app. He watched me work, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence between us. "Thank you for carrying this," he said. Not dramatically, not apologetically, just truthfully. "We both carried it," I answered, closing the folder gently on my lap. The pages inside settled together with a faint rustle, forming a unified whole. It wasn't victory. It wasn't triumph. It was a clear line drawn and agreed upon. When we arrived home, I placed the folder on the dining table, opened only long enough to add a small label marking the new section we'd completed. Then I moved the entire folder into our secure drawer, locking it with a soft turn of the key. The lock clicked into place with a sound that felt almost like an exhale. My husband leaned against the doorway, arms crossed gently in front of him. "Feels different now," he said. "Like we're not waiting anymore." I nodded without turning. That's what happens when the facts are settled. Everything else starts falling into place. Before closing the drawer, I ran my fingers along the folder's spine one last time. A quiet gesture of acknowledgement, not attachment. Everything inside was now complete. Evidence, agreements, confirmations, stamps. The house felt unusually calm as I shut the drawer and straightened. No residue of conflict lingered in the air. No tension humming beneath the surface. Just space. Open, uncoiled, steady. As I walked toward the kitchen, the faint sound of the drawer settling into place followed me, soft and deliberate. The moment didn't feel like an ending. It felt like alignment choosing its own quiet place to rest. A few days later, she called while I was folding laundry in the living room. Her voice was controlled, almost overly polite as she asked whether we had reconsidered the spare key situation. I paused, a towel half folded in my hands. "We're following the agreement," I said, keeping my tone level. There was a brief silence on her end, a soft exhale almost too quiet to register. "I thought maybe, now that things are settled," she began. I gently redirected her. "They are settled, and the agreement is part of that." She didn't argue. Instead, she murmured a muted, "All right," and the call ended with a soft click. I placed my phone down beside the folded stacks. No friction, no escalation, just adherence to a boundary she was still learning how to live with. That afternoon she texted again, this time with a request for an additional evening with the baby. Her message was warmer, less expectant, shaped more like a question than a claim. I read it twice, then typed slowly. We can adjust. Let's trade Tuesday for Friday. The shift wasn't about obligations. It was about mutual flexibility. She replied within minutes, thanking me with a sincerity that didn't feel forced. My husband glanced at the screen over my shoulder and nodded in approval. That feels fair, he said. His voice held a note of ease I hadn't heard in weeks, like he was finally participating in the solution instead of bracing against the conflict. Later, he installed a small safe in our bedroom closet, positioning it carefully against the back wall. For the paperwork, he said, lifting it into place with both hands. The metal made a muted, weighted sound as it touched the floor, solid, grounding. When he spun the combination dial for the first time, the clicks were crisp, final. He placed the key on the upper shelf, then stepped back with a quiet pride that wasn't about secrecy but stewardship. I watched him close the safe door, his shoulders relaxing as though the room had gained a new anchor. For the first time, the responsibility for our boundaries felt shared. Downstairs, I reorganized the workspace. I cleared the dining table, wiped down the surface, and returned pens, notepads, and loose pages to their proper drawers. The folder, upright on the shelf, stood without leaning in either direction, balanced, secure. I placed a fresh stack of blank paper beside it, not because I expected more conflict, but because order had become part of the rhythm of the house. The afternoon light drifted across the table in slow arcs, illuminating the newly quiet space. I paused, letting my hand rest on the back of a chair. The stillness felt earned rather than temporary. That evening, I opened my journal for the first time since this had begun. On a fresh page, I wrote only one line. Respect is the foundation. No elaboration, no emotional unraveling, just the distilled truth that had carried us through the noise. I closed the journal and placed it back on the nightstand, the cover soft against my fingertips. Upstairs, my husband was putting toys into a small storage bin, humming under his breath in a relaxed, absent-minded way that told me the tension had drained from his body. It was the kind of ordinary sound that marks the return of normalcy. When the house settled into nighttime quiet, the air felt strikingly different, light, unburdened. I slipped under the covers, listening to the steady rhythm of my husband's breathing beside me. No unresolved questions hovered in the dark. No unspoken expectations circling the room. Only rest. Deep, uninterrupted rest. I closed my eyes and let the quiet sink in. Boundaries had not created distance. They had created stability. And stability, once recognized, had a way of calming everything it touched. For the first time in weeks, I fell asleep without replaying conversations or preparing counterpoints. I slept through the night, plainly, peacefully, completely. The following weekend, we sat at the dining table drafting the family calendar. Birthdays, shared meals, holidays. My husband pulled up a spreadsheet while I reviewed the MOU to ensure our plans aligned with the boundaries we had agreed on. We added a clear note beside each month. No unannounced visits. It was a simple line, but its presence felt like a safeguard rather than a restriction. He typed steadily, pausing every so often to ask, "Does this time work for you?" There was no tension behind the question, only partnership. When we finished, the calendar looked less like an obligation and more like a rhythm, something practical, predictable, and kind. He emailed her a copy with a short message, sharing our schedule for clarity. No explanation, no hesitation. We moved on to birthdays and yearly celebrations, deciding that events would be finalized 30 days in advance. "It gives everyone time to adjust," I said. He nodded, adjusting the formatting on the screen to make each event color-coded. It seemed like a small thing, but visual order had become part of how we carried our peace. When he attached the calendar to the email, he double-checked the dates before pressing send. "There," he murmured, leaning back. The house felt strangely lighter, as if the simple act of planning had created more space in the air around us. Organization, I realized, wasn't clinical. It was compassionate. Next, we updated the section in the MOU addressing residency. "No temporary or long-term stay requests," I read aloud. He repeated the wording softly to himself, testing how it sounded in real conversation. "It's clear," he said. "It doesn't insult anyone. It just defines reality." I placed the document back on the table, smoothing its edge. "Definitions matter," I replied. "They keep us from drifting into arguments we never needed to have." He nodded thoughtfully, the truth settling into him with quiet acceptance. Our conversations were no longer navigations around conflict. They were confirmations of how to avoid it. My husband went upstairs and returned with a small, fireproof file box he had purchased earlier that week. "For the final documents," he said, placing it on the table. Inside, thick foam lining waited for the folder like a structured form of reassurance. He placed the MOU inside first, then the stamped copies from the county office, followed by the gift letter. Each piece slid into place with a soft scrape. When he closed the lid, the metal latch snapped shut with a clean, confident click. "This helps me breathe," he admitted. It wasn't dramatic, just honest. Before putting the box away, I taped a small label to the inside of the lid. "Family Agreements. Do not remove." Not as a warning, but as an anchor, something future versions of us might rely on when memory blurred. He ran his hand over the lid once, absorbing the weight of everything inside. "Thank you," he said again, calmer this time, without the heaviness he carried earlier in the process. I touched his wrist lightly. "We built this together." Outside, a soft breeze brushed against the window screen, carrying the faint sound of a neighbor's wind chime. He placed the file box on the top shelf of the closet, where it fit securely between a stack of quilts and a winter coat he rarely wore. When he returned to the dining room, I had already cleared the table, leaving it bare and well lit in the afternoon sun. We stood there for a moment, neither speaking, just letting the simplicity of the space settle around us. Boundaries weren't walls, they were agreements. Agreements weren't punishments, they were understandings. And understandings, once shared, created peace without asking for anything in return. We breathed in the stillness at the same time, the house quiet, steady, aligned. In the weeks that followed, the shift in our home was noticeable. Quiet, steady, almost imperceptible unless you knew what had preceded it. She visited on her scheduled days, arriving with a soft knock instead of an assumption. When she stepped inside, she carried only her purse, never a suitcase, never a hint of expectation beyond the time we'd arranged. The boundaries we'd agreed upon didn't make her distant, they made her calmer. She sat on the living room rug with the baby, humming softly, her attention absorbed in small hands and tiny laughter. Watching them, I felt something settle, a confirmation that structure didn't limit love, it steadied it. Her presence became less about intrusion and more about connection, shaped gently by the framework we had built together. One evening during dinner, she began telling a story from her younger years. It wasn't prompted. It wasn't strategic. She simply started speaking while spooning vegetables onto her plate. She talked about a time she had lent a significant amount of money to a cousin, without paperwork, without agreement, and how the relationship eventually fractured under the weight of unspoken expectations. "We stopped talking for almost 10 years, she said quietly. The clinking of silverware softened, as if even the dishes were listening. She didn't tie the story to our situation. She didn't apologize or justify anything. She just remembered. And in remembering, she revealed the roots of her worry, her fear of being erased when generosity went undocumented. I didn't correct her. I didn't offer reassurance or analysis. I simply nodded, letting her own story speak for itself. Sometimes acknowledgement is the only response needed. My husband glanced at me, his expression signaling the same understanding. She continued eating, slower now, the tension around her shoulders eased by the simple act of being heard. Moments like this didn't erase the strain we'd been through, but they softened its edges. The more she spoke, the more I realized her pushiness had been more about insecurity than entitlement. She had equated contribution with relevance, paperwork with exclusion. And now, without the burden of ambiguity, she didn't need to grasp at either. After dinner, we washed dishes together. A quiet, almost choreographed routine. She handed plates to me. I rinsed them. My husband dried. No dot. No friction. No commentary. Just 3 people sharing a space without stepping on each other's boundaries. The sound of porcelain touching porcelain felt oddly peaceful. She didn't mention the house, the key, the money, or the agreement. Not once. Instead, she commented on how tall the baby was getting, how fast time moved, how family looked different at every stage. Her voice carried no defensiveness, only presence. It felt like an unspoken acknowledgement that we had found something functional, something livable. Later that night, after she left, I sent her a short text. "Thank you for today." I didn't elaborate. I didn't attach meaning or subtext. She replied with a simple, "Me too." No punctuation, no overthinking, just 2 words that felt sincere. I sat on the couch for a moment, absorbing the quiet in the room. It wasn't the heavy quiet of earlier weeks. It was the kind that comes from things being in their right place. My husband joined me, his hand brushing mine. "This feels good," he said softly. I nodded. "It feels earned." When I finally went upstairs, I paused at the doorway, listening to the last remnants of evening settling into the house. No lingering tension, no scattered energy, just a steady, grounded calm. I whispered a brief line into the quiet. "Clarity is kindness." Then I turned off the hallway light and stepped into the bedroom, letting the darkness fold gently around the day we'd just lived. It wasn't resolution in the dramatic sense. It was something more sustainable. The beginning of a relationship rebuilt, not on obligation, not on leverage, but on understanding, shaped carefully, page by page, choice by choice, until it could finally hold its own weight. Spring arrived quietly, the kind of season that doesn't announce itself so much as appear. Soft light in the mornings, cooler air drifting through slightly opened windows. One afternoon, she stopped by at her scheduled time, carrying a small bag of fruit and a gentle smile that no longer concealed anything. She wiped her shoes on the mat, knocked lightly, and waited for us to open the door. The simple civility felt like a new language we had all learned together. She held the baby with easy affection, swaying gently while humming a tune from her own childhood. Watching her, I realized how much our lives had shifted, not outwardly, but in the architecture beneath everything, where boundaries had restored safety instead of creating distance. The house felt lived in, not negotiated over. While she sat on the couch playing with the baby, my husband brewed tea for the 3 of us. He brought the cups into the living room, setting them down carefully. She accepted hers with a quiet nod, fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. We spoke about ordinary things, the neighbor's new fence, a recipe she was excited to try, a book she had recently borrowed. There was no subtext threaded between her sentences, no layered meaning hiding behind casual remarks. Just presence. A steadiness that didn't need to announce itself. My husband caught my eye briefly, a silent acknowledgement that we had arrived somewhere neither of us had fully imagined months ago. When it was time for her to leave, she returned the toys to their baskets without being asked, her movements unhurried and respectful. At the door she paused and rested her hand lightly on the frame. "I'm glad we found our way through," she said. Her tone wasn't emotional. It was sincere, quietly measured. I nodded. "So are we." My husband hugged her gently, and she embraced him without the weight of expectation. She stepped outside and turned back once more. "Thank you for keeping things clear," she said. Then she walked down the path toward her car, the late afternoon sunlight catching her shoulders in a soft strip of gold that made her seem smaller, calmer, more human. After she left, the house settled into its natural rhythm again, warm, lived in, uncomplicated. My husband stood in the foyer for a moment before exhaling, the kind of breath that comes from recognizing stability after months of imbalance. We returned to the living room, where the last of the daylight stretched across the rug in long, quiet shapes. I picked up a stray blanket and folded it with absent-minded precision. He joined me, placing a small stack of board books back on the shelf. Together, we restored the room to its simple order. Later that night, I opened the journal on my nightstand and wrote a final line beneath the others. Boundaries protect love, not from people, but for people. I closed the journal and slid it back into the drawer, the soft thud of the wood meeting wood echoing faintly in the quiet room. My husband was brushing his teeth, humming an off-key tune that made the room feel warmer. I lay back against the pillows, letting the day settle around me. There was no tension to sift through, no lingering questions to rehearse, no dread circling in the background, only certainty, shaped gently by process and patience. Before turning off the light, I thought of the folder tucked safely in the closet, organized, complete, untouched for weeks now. It wasn't a symbol of conflict anymore. It was a symbol of clarity, and clarity had become the quiet foundation of our home. I switched off the lamp, letting the room dim into a soft darkness. My husband climbed into bed beside me, his hand finding mine with easy familiarity. We breathed together, slow and even, the way people do when life has finally aligned with truth. Outside, a faint night breeze brushed against the window. Inside, everything felt settled, earned, defined, and quietly whole. In the end, nothing dramatic marked the moment things finally settled. No shouting, no slammed doors, no grand confrontation, just clarity, quiet, steady, earned. The gift became what it had always been. The house became fully ours. And she became something simpler, softer. A grandmother who understood where she stood. Not because we pushed her out, but because we finally drew the lines that let everyone breathe again. Boundaries didn't make us less of a family. They made us a healthier one. Looking back, the real victory wasn't in the paperwork, the signatures, or the stamped pages filed neatly in a drawer. It was in the space that opened afterward. The laughter returning to the house, the evenings without tension, the visits that felt warm instead of heavy. It was in watching her love the baby without trying to claim the rooms around him. If this story reminded you of someone you know, or a moment you've lived through, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Share your experience, your perspective, or even your questions. And if you want more stories like this, honest, cinematic, and rooted in real family truths, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next one.